like I said, was going to be more of isokinetics and accommodating resistance. Then we're going to get into, the performance mindset. We probably won't get that deep into it. We didn't get that deep into it yesterday morning, but we'll see. So when we think about sports and functional movement, it's really all about angles. And one of the reasons why I like talking this talk, is particularly is because if you are an athlete or you were an athlete or you work with athletes, you really understand this, right? I had a really cool experience with some defensive linemen when I was working with the Pittsburgh Steelers guys, and some really cool conversations about the little nuances of being a defensive lineman. And it was all about getting the right angle, right? Just getting this little shift in your weight into the right position, or your hands or your hips into the right position. And you think about most sports, especially like combat sports like boxing and martial arts, it's all about angles. Like most people think that it's just two guys out there swinging punches, but it's all about getting into these correct positions and turning to the side. A lot of times when somebody gets knocked out in a combat sport of some type, it's usually because they're getting hit from an angle where they don't see it coming. So the person that's throwing the punch is trying to get into a position where they can hit somebody without them seeing it coming as much as they would when they're straight on. So angles are everything, right? And again, that's just kind of like this anecdotal thing here, but what we're really talking about right now is this idea of angles during exercise and in accommodating resistance, and more into isokinetics. Right. And with angular momentum and angular velocity and angular acceleration, we're thinking about how the limbs move and how the body moves, right? And versus trying to get these angles in sports. And accommodating resistance, especially isokinetics, is designed to work on angular acceleration, which if you come down here to this term rate of force production, right? Rate of force production is what we see as the main difference between elite level athletes and basically your average athletes, right? Is that their ability to create force quickly over a short period of time is much more, they're much better at doing that than your average athlete. And most of your strength and conditioning programs at the elite levels focus on this ability to rapidly create force. The interesting part about it is that even with isokinetics, you can never really go from a point of zero to some type of movement, and we have static and dynamic, right? So power starts to come in when we become dynamic. When it's static, you're not really working on power because there's no movement, right? We're just talking about physics. But really, most of the time, what happens is it's not just about velocity, right? And this is the point, is that when we're looking at isokinetics, the word means same speed, right? But it's actually kind of a misnomer, because the truth of the matter is that there's an accelerating property, especially at the initial phase. So the initial phase, there's usually zero resistance when you're doing something that's isokinetic. Heather, I don't know how much experience you have this, and Mark, Noah definitely has seen this machine that we have here on the right. Basically, it's a closed kinetic chain isokinetic machine. You can do it for open chain stuff as well. But with isokinetics primarily, there's usually, and you can, different isokinetic machines, you can add eccentric resistance to it, or it has an eccentric phase. But most in isokinetics, we're looking at working in the concentric phase. So if you can imagine him going and pushing up out of this position, initially, you're not really going to get any movement in that first half second, right? As he goes to create force, it's just this rapid acceleration of his force production that's happening. So one of the points of that is that when we look at rotational angular force, it's actually called torque. It's not force. So we're really looking at the rate of torque development, not the rate of force development. And I'm not like a wordsmith or trying to, pull punches and mince words or anything like that. But it's important to understand that we're not talking about linear forces when we're talking about human movement. They're almost all accelerating, right? And there's very few ways that we can work on acceleration, especially with weights and body weight exercises. You start kind of running out of runway. And that's one of the reasons why using accommodating resistance is so important, is because we can work on acceleration through our torque production as we're moving through these movements. So, and I'm going to get more into that as we go. So after that, first accelerating phase, right, you do get this constant velocity phase that kicks in, right? On this particular machine that we have, and we're going to talk more about it, is that it actually allows you to accelerate the whole way throughout the movement. And that's the difference. The guy that invented this machine back in the 70s was well aware that athletic movements are accelerating, and as well as that, technically isokinetics is an accelerating movement. So they're an accelerating exercise. So he ended up deciding to make a machine that focused on acceleration, that allowed you to accelerate throughout the range of motion, right? So the other interesting thing about this is that, you guys are all familiar with the term isotonic, right? Isometric, isotonic, isokinetic, a basic term, right? But isotonic is also, in a sense, a misnomer in a certain way as well, because it assumes that we have this same tension that's going throughout the movement. And, that comes from the fact that everything that we do with isotonics, we're focusing on using gravity, whether it's an additional weight or we're just doing body weight type of exercises. So that accelerating force is 9.8 meters per second square. So it's not really the same speed, but we're getting the same tension, but we have the same acceleration that's going on with this because we're working on gravity. But these researchers in, I want to say it was Poland or Germany, the place that I was reading about this, which I thought was a pretty interesting thing. I had to do a lot of research and learning of isokinetics when I was at the University of Cincinnati, because we did it for return to sports testing with athletes. And I had never heard of this term called oxotonic or allodynamic. So these researchers in Europe came up with this term because you weren't seeing the same length or the same tension, in an isotonic movement. You're actually seeing a change in the length and in the tension throughout the movement. So they ended up giving it this name. Have you guys ever heard of that term, oxotonic? I know you guys are in school right now. Yeah. So I thought that was a pretty interesting thing. And it actually, in one of the articles, it was spelled AUKSO tonic. So it was another derivative of a different language, which I thought was pretty cool. And so this is one of the reasons also why we're talking about this, because historically, we named something, a certain thing 50 years ago, and now the history or the research is showing us that, these terms aren't exactly correct for understanding what's actually happening during these movements. Anybody got any questions or thoughts on that stuff?
Yeah, I do.
Sure, let's go.
How are you relating isokinetics or this machine to fast twitch production?
Yeah, great question, right? So when we're working on acceleration and rate of force production primarily, right, it's very much geared towards working on fast twitch muscle fiber contraction. And that's one of the things that's the benefit of using isokinetics in accommodating resistance in general, is that as we increase the speed of the motion and also in the rate of force production, we see a high EMG activity of the fast twitch muscle fibers as well, right? So the coolest part about more isokinetics than just accommodating resistance is that you can get really maximum force production, because it's a very safe way to do it, because there's no eccentric loading. So when you have no eccentric loading, you can get this maximum force production. It's kind of like the idea of pulling your punches. If I'm going to go to punch something and I know it's going to hurt my fist, I'm not going to punch as hard. Or like the new plyometrics boxes, they have those soft foam boxes that you can jump on. One of the biggest benefits of them is that you're going to actually try to jump higher, because you're not going to be afraid to end up landing on skinning your knee type of thing. So isokinetics really allow for that. Well, and I'm going to kind of, spoiler alert here. One of the challenges is the research on this hasn't been very good in athletes, right? So we haven't done a lot of testing for a functional transfer in fast twitch muscle fiber in terms of plyometrics or vertical jump or an actual 40-yard dash time or anything like that. So at least from what I know, and there could be some research out there that I haven't come across at this point, but that's one of the criticisms of isokinetics, is that it does it in this isolated closed chain, or open chain type of situation, where we're getting all these great properties from it, but from a functional standpoint, there's not necessarily a lot of correlation in that direction, if that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely.